Daniel reveals the dream that the king Nebuchadnezzar had. And he tells him what would come to pass, what the king had seen. In verse 31, it speaks about a great image whose form was terrible. Then in verse number 32, it talks about its head was fine gold. Verse 32 also, its breast and arms were of silver. Its belly and thighs were of brass. All that in verse 32. Verse 33, his legs were of iron, feet were of iron and clay. And then in verse number 34, it speaks about a stone that was cut out without man's hands. And that stone would break the images into pieces. You see that there in verse number 34. And if you go into verses 36 through 45, after he had revealed that dream, then what does he do? He interprets the dream for King Nebuchadnezzar. And this is really a stepping stone for Daniel. He is going to make this interpretation. First of all, tell the king what he had dreamed, and then he's going to tell him what the dream was. But because of that, he's going to be elevated in the king's sight and in the king's realm. So he begins there in verses 37 and 38. And he says there that Nebuchadnezzar is the head, that's gold. And then there's another kingdom inferior to Babylon will rise after them, verse 39. Then there's the third kingdom in verse 39. Verse 40 gives us another kingdom. And verses 41 through 43, this fourth kingdom would be delivered, which would be the iron and clay. And it would be partly strong and partly brittle, or not as strong. And then in verse 44, it says, "In the days of the fourth kingdom, the God of heaven will set up his kingdom, which shall never be destroyed." And that kingdom would be not be an earthly kingdom. Of course, he's speaking there about the kingdom, the church that would be established. Remember, we talked about how over there in Acts chapter 2 that Peter speaks there about what Joel chapter 2 talked about and what Isaiah chapter 2 talked about. But then here is Daniel chapter 2 speaking about the establishment of the kingdom, the church. And so that's what he's speaking of in this. Now, when he reveals this, of course, we could go back and talk about those various kingdoms. But really, the main thing to understand is it begins with Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian kingdom, and then it comes down to the church, the kingdom that would be lasting forever. And that really is the thing that we want to make sure we have in our thoughts. And the reason for that is because God has all those things in place. How many times, as we've looked at these books, chapters and verses, have we talked about the providence of God? How God is bringing about the very promise that he made. First he made the promise there in Genesis chapter 3, and then he made the promise to Abraham about this great nation that would come up. And he was talking there about the church. So in verse 46 and 47 of Daniel chapter 2, look at what he says there in this reading. Let me get back to that. In verse 46 and 47, there it says, "Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of lords, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret." Now remember, we talked about this last time, how that it speaks here about Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he speaks about Daniel's God. But if you'll notice there, it speaks about he is a God of gods. What does that mean? God of gods.
So it means he doesn't recognize him as the only God, but that he is the top God.
All right. He does not recognize him as the only God. He just says here is a God that was above the gods that his astrologers, his seers would use. And later on we'll find that he's going to make a decree concerning Jehovah. But Nebuchadnezzar does not ultimately acknowledge there's only one God. He is recognizing Daniel's God as just one of the gods. Because there's, the idolatry was so rampant. And we've talked about how in the world even today, there are so many gods in religions. I'm told, I've not been there, I've not seen that, but I can remember people talking about going to India, and they would go into places, and there would be shelves, and those shelves would be filled with icons, with little statues of gods. They would make a god for everything, and most of the time it's for things such as this. Things could not be explained. We even come to our country, and we have the Native Americans. They had gods for everything. And I suppose if we would go and talk to some of them today, they would have the same idea, that they have gods for many things. The rain, the sun, the stars, the crops, the corn, all of those things were things anything. I think it could be summed up. Anything that would give them a benefit, they were willing to make a god out of. Establish a god. So here Nebuchadnezzar, when it speaks about recognizing Daniel's God of gods, just meaning he incorporated him into thinking of the gods that he would have. In verse 48, Daniel is made a great man. He's ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Now, in Genesis chapter 39, we find a similar thing there when we think about Joseph. Joseph went into Egypt, sold down into bondage, and there in Genesis 39, beginning in verse number 5, here the scripture says, "And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and over all that he had, and the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person, and well favored." So the same thing took place with Joseph. Now, again, here's God's hand, God's providence, making sure that his people are going to survive, because it's through the nation of Israel, specifically the tribe of Judah, that the Savior is going to come. As we talked about there a minute ago, or mentioned a minute ago, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. God made that promise, and that promise is going to come to pass. And it went, and we talked about this last time as well. God could foresee things. He saw ahead, and still today sees ahead what's going to happen. But even with the kings of the nation of Israel, it was not God's plan for them to have kings. But God knew they were going to have kings, because prior to them having kings, what did he do? He set up the qualification, the regulation for who would be a king. So, he did not want that, but because he knew they were going to, he put things in place to regulate the things about being a king. So we find here that Daniel, even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to be placed in places of position. How will Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how will they be elevated? What will cause them to be elevated in the king's kingdom? When Daniel received it, he requested that, and he made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be a part of that affair. Let me go back over here. When he was made that, and then Daniel, it says, he sat in the gate of the king. Have we read anything other books or places where we would read about people who would sit in the king's gate? Remember Mordecai? There he was sitting in the king's gate, and I've always never quite understood how it was that Mordecai was in that position, because he was a Jew. And that was something maybe was a little different. God didn't explain it to us, but we know that he was there in that place, and he was able to overhear the plot to kill the king, and made that known through Esther, and because of that he was elevated to a position in the king's palace. But there in verse number 49, where it says, then Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but David sat in the gate of the king. Now, I honestly don't know what advantage that would give to him. I don't know. I know that it was a place of honor as people would go into those places. It was a place that was set aside as an honorable thing. But here we find that Daniel is going to be there sitting in the place of the king.
Those people who sat in the gate with him also acted as advisors, didn't they?
Well, yes, they were there in a place of advising. One commentator said it was a place where courts were held and public business was usually transacted. But what we do know is it was a place of position. It was something to be put in that position, to be able to. I would venture to say that not everybody was allowed to sit at the gate of the king, and so it was something that was a special thing. Anybody have any comments or questions before we go on any further? Yes.
I just think it's one of those things that God doesn't explain to us. That usually whenever we see, like in the New Testament, whenever we see somebody fall down to worship one of the apostles, that, the angel said, don't worship me, worship God. But whenever this king falls down at the feet of Daniel to worship him, he's not told that we see here.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the idea behind that is he gave homage to Daniel. Not the idea. I don't think the idea was, and it could have very well been that he was, he put Daniel in the position of somebody special because of what he had done, as he would, with other gods that he had. And when he speaks there about the God of gods, Daniel's God, we would say, well, he had a special thought in mind about Daniel, and it does say, he did bow down. I think the idea there is honored him above others. Anybody else? We're in Daniel, going into Daniel chapter 3. Yes.
Where Nebuchadnezzar placed God above, but other gods below. Things haven't changed a whole lot today, because we have one religion that calls
Right. Yeah, there's the religion, of course, that has all the statues and all the they have their icons they bow down to and pray through their saints. And it's interesting how they come about. If you want to read something interesting, look at how they come about deciding who's going to be a saint. So it's really interesting. Kevin?
I know that Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful man, most powerful man on the face of the earth at that time. Distracted, had all sorts of things, coming towards him all the time. But in the first chapter, it talks about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel being found 10 times more wiser than all of his astrologers and all his advisors. So he recognized them then as being way more wise. And then when he couldn't find anybody to interpret his dream, he was willing to kill everybody who were in those positions until Daniel did do that. And then he elevates Daniel again, plus Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So he was kind of fickle in his, he was distracted and didn't always have the things in front of his mind that he should have.
Right. Nebuchadnezzar was, he took advantage of what was there. And it's interesting, as you were saying, he had the dream. And he had his astrologers and his seers and all of those. And he told them, they said, you tell us what your dream was and we'll tell you what the dream meant. And he said, no, you tell me what the dream was and then tell me what it meant. And if you can't tell me what it was, you're going to lose your life. In fact, I think it says it'd be cut in pieces and your house destroyed. But then Daniel comes along, and as we said, by the hand of God, by the providence of God, we find Daniel being elevated to a position. And then we're going to find out that he's going to be demoted a little bit later, and then he's going to be elevated once again. But here we come into chapter 3 now, and I've titled this chapter Divine Deliverance. And really what this is, when you read through chapter 3, what you really see there is a test of true faith. Now, we talked about this one time earlier. Faith is what we have to have if we're going to please God. And we have to demonstrate that faith, James chapter 2 says. But when we come into a circumstance like with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and later with Daniel, this came upon them. But the thing I want you to have in your mind when we go into this chapter is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had already demonstrated their faithfulness to God. And they had already made up their mind they were going to be faithful to God in all circumstances. Because here we're going to read in chapter 3 about a really dire circumstance. One that's kind of hard for us to imagine. But what I want you to think about as we go into this is the fact that I don't believe that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when this came about with the idol, with the bowing down, I don't think they had to stop and say, well, now what should we do? I think they already were prepared to do what God wanted them to do. And my point there is, like with us today, have we made up our minds that we're going to be faithful to God at all cost? Or do we, at the last moment, try to decide if we're going to be faithful or not? We talked about this a little bit Wednesday. And I use this as an example because it's maybe the most practiced sin we have, and that's the forsaking the assembling of the saints. What would happen to people today if there was a law came out and said you can't assemble to worship? Do you think that would affect the people who don't assemble faithfully? Do you think they would mind very much if they didn't have to go? Because they could say, well, we can't go because there's a law. But you see, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there was a law. not only was there a covenant of law that was given, there was also punishment that was laid out with that law. If you violate this law, here's what's going to happen to you. But they were prepared mentally to be faithful to God at all cost. It's much like you go into a marriage relationship. You marry, you make a covenant with one another, and I've never done a wedding that I didn't say that you would be faithful to one another all the days of your life. You go into that marriage with your mindset, you're going to be faithful. And when you do that, if you have that in your mind and you've determined that, then you can maintain that faithfulness. But as we go in now to chapter 3, in this chapter we're going to find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced with a very difficult choice: to remain faithful to God or to die. What about the first century Christians? Do you think they had that same mindset as well? Be faithful to God or die. You know, I've read this from secular writers. There was a man named Polycarp in the first century, and we're told that he was an elder in the church, and he was told to denounce God, denounce Christianity, and they tied him to a stake and said, if you don't denounce, you're going to be burned. You can save your life. All you have to do is just denounce Christianity. And he said that the Lord had not forsaken him, and he would not forsake the Lord. And he was burned at the stake. I mean, to me, that's almost an unimaginable thing that a person would have to bear up under. But, as I said, you go into whatever it is, into your Christianity, and whatever comes, if you've made up your mind ahead of time that you're going to be faithful, you don't have to decide, am I going to be faithful now or not? So, as we go into this now, we're going to see that they were already practicing their faith. In verses 1 through 7, we find that Nebuchadnezzar decides, and now he just got through saying a little bit ago that Daniel's God was the God of gods. Now he comes back into chapter 3, and he begins there in verse number 1. It says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Well, what do we find? We find him putting this statue, this image up. And it's not just a small thing. If you look at the 60 cubits, and you have to, some determined that cubits was 18 inches, and others decided that it's like 22 inches. When you look at it, it's going to be a very tall thing. Some estimate that image that he's going to put up to be 60 feet tall by 9 feet. That's an awfully, and it's going to be put out there in where everybody can see it. Now, what's he want people to do with that? He wants people to bow down to it. If you look at verse number 2, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent together the princes, the governors, and the captains, and judges, the treasurers, and counselors, and sheriffs, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had set up. Then it goes on in verse 3, says, Then the princes and governors and captains and judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the province were gathered together under the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Well, then he goes on. And he then begins to speak about what's going to happen when that image is to be worshipped, or they're to bow down to it. He says there in verse 4, Then an herald cried aloud, To you is commanded, O people, nations, and language. Now here's a commandment that's being given. He says there that at that time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music. Ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, shall the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So he sets up this image, and his commandment is that people bow down to it, to worship it. Well, it's going to be something that is visible. They're going to have to do that, and the understanding here is the commandment. And he says, if you don't, you're going to be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Verses 4 and 5, that decree went out to all the people. Verse 6, the understanding was that if you did not bow down to it, you'd be thrown into that burning fiery furnace. Then in verse number 7, where it says, therefore at that time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worship that, he shall be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, we've got these Chaldeans, and that's the people of the nation there. And it seems as if the way this reads is they spied out or looked upon those three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And one commentator said, well, they were probably not happy with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why? Because they'd been put in a high position with Daniel. Daniel and those three had been put in a high position. So these Chaldeans, and it would not be all of the Chaldeans, but this certain group of Chaldeans, they are going to go tell the king that these did not bow down to that image. And if you look at verse 12, the way that's worded makes you think that is the case. It says, there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not the gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So it seems, like I said there in verse number 12, that they're saying these three that you put in this high position, they're not honoring you, and that is to say, we are. We're honoring what you have decreed, but they're not, and you have elevated them to a high position. So the picture here is the image and the decree. The people were bowing down, with the exception of our reading here of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As I was going through that reading, I thought to myself, I wonder where Daniel was at this time. And of course, we don't have the record of that. God didn't intend for us to have that. But it went through my mind, I wonder where Daniel was. But we do know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in that position, and they would not bow down to worship. Of course, we know that the Hebrews, the Jews, had been given a law that would prohibit them bowing down to an image. When they came out of Egypt and Moses received the law at Mount Sinai, we know there that in Exodus chapter 20, it tells us there that they were not to have any graven image, no gods before me, not making any graven images. Well, here they are. They remember that law, and they're not going to bow down to the king's image. But when we look at this, we think about their situation and the choice they had to make. And I think that's what we have to have in mind. I think one of the main things out of this chapter, the choice they had to make. We've already talked about. I believe they made the choice before they had to make the choice, if that makes sense. They made a choice before it ever came to the point they had to make that choice. And that's the same thing with us, is it not? Don't we have to settle our minds that we're going to be faithful to God at all cost, no matter what? We're going to be faithful to God. We're going to do His will and His will only, and not give ourselves over to the things of the world. I think about what is said in Joshua 24 and verse 15. Because in Joshua 24:15, coming to the close of that book, it says, "And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Ammonites or Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And that verse is used over and over and over again about, or connected with the fact that we have to make a choice. You and I have to make a choice. And we make choices every day as to whether we're going to be faithful or not faithful. And we don't think about it. And I'm not saying we get up every morning and we think about all the things that we may have to face through the day and say with ourselves, we're going to do what's right. We have that's something that's in us. That's something that's down inside of us. And we don't know what trial or tribulation or temptation is going to come to us. Kevin?
2 points here. One's totally supposition, the other one's fact. I believe that these Chaldeans probably planted it in Nebuchadnezzar's brain to build this image, knowing that these people would not bow to it. Much the same way that they set Daniel up when he prayed towards Jerusalem. But then the other one, the one that's fact, is before Daniel interpreted the dream, he went to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they prayed that this would come about. So they had a prayer life. They prayed every day to give them strength to withstand this sort of thing, and even to the point of being burned.
Right. That was one of the things we talked about earlier concerning Daniel when he went and he was told to make that interpretation. Well, he said, "Give me time." Now he wasn't needing time to be able to do what God wanted him to do, but he had the time. He went to, as Kevin said, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they had prayer together. Very often you read in the Bible about when there were circumstances such as that, there was unity and prayer within that group. And we talked about in Acts chapter 4 with Peter and John, when they were oppressed, what did they do after they were let go? They went and they found those of like precious faith, and they prayed together. But in this, we find that he had gone and he prayed, and as Kevin said, they had a prayer life. It was not just every now and again they had a test, but they were prepared. They had practiced their faith. I guess that's the best way to say it. They had practiced their faith even while they were in captivity. And here we find that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, they've already made a choice. I believe they already knew what they would do in all these circumstances. And as I said, it's something that it's here. It's not just the particular things that we think, well, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that. But it's something we have inside of us, our faith that we're going to practice, as James 2 tells us. But it's here, and when something comes, then we're able to overcome it. we're able to push it aside because we have already determined we're going to be faithful to God. As I said, how much simpler and easier would it be if a husband and wife had that same mindset when they go into a marriage? We are going to be faithful. And how do you do that? By honoring God first. And then all things are going to work out. Okay, well, we'll stop there and we'll come back and pick up there in about verse number 8.